All right, so get this. You sent us this piece by Nelly Oliveira on the Lord's Prayer.
Okay.
And I'm like, okay, I know this prayer.
Right.
But then I started reading, and whoa, this isn't just about reciting words.
No.
Oliveira breaks down these 7 codes hidden in it.
Uh-huh.
And it's like a blueprint for a whole different way of living.
It's fascinating how Oliveira takes something so familiar and reveals these deeper layers of meaning.
Yeah.
He starts by challenging our assumptions about prayer itself.
Okay.
Showing how Jesus revolutionized it.
Okay, so back then, prayer was all about going to the temple, right?
Yeah.
Lots of formality, very public. But Jesus kind of flipped the script.
He absolutely did. Oliveira points out that Jesus took prayer out of the temple and made it deeply personal.
Yeah.
He even says, when you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father who is unseen. Wow. That's straight from Matthew chapter 6, verse 6.
It's interesting because I've always struggled with the idea of praying anytime, anywhere. My mind wanders. There are distractions.
Yeah.
It feels almost disrespectful to just launch into prayer in the middle of, say, folding laundry.
Right.
Maybe that's my own hang-up, you know?
Yeah.
Maybe it's more about the attitude, the connection, rather than the physical location.
I think you've hit on something important there.
Yeah.
It's about cultivating that inner space where you can connect with God, regardless of the outer circumstances.
Okay.
And that leads us to Oliveira's first code, which is all about the power of addressing God as Father.
See, now this is where I get a little stuck.
Okay.
Father is such a loaded word. What about people who had terrible fathers?
Right.
Or those who never even knew their dad?
Yeah.
Does that mean they can't connect with God in the same way?
That's a really insightful question.
Yeah.
And I think it highlights the importance of understanding the context of Jesus' teachings. In his time, the concept of God as a loving, caring father was revolutionary. It challenged the prevailing view of a distant authoritarian God who demanded obedience through fear.
So it was about redefining the very nature of the relationship.
Exactly.
Making it more intimate, more accessible.
Exactly. And I think for those who have struggled with the concept of father, it can be helpful to explore other metaphors or images that resonate with them.
Okay.
Maybe it's mother or shepherd or creator.
Right.
The key is finding that language that allows you to connect with the divine in a way that feels authentic and meaningful.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
It's not about getting hung up on the literal word, but about tapping into the essence of what that word represents. Love, care, provision.
Yeah.
So we've moved prayer from the temple to the heart and established a deeply personal connection. Where does Oliveira take us next?
He dives into the phrase, hallowed be thy name. Now, at first glance, it might seem like we're just supposed to say the words.
Right.
But Oliveira suggests it's about so much more than that.
Okay.
He's getting at the concept of sanctification, of treating God's name with reverence and respect.
Okay, so not just saying the words, but living them.
Right.
But what does that look like in practice?
Yeah.
Is it about going to church every Sunday? Or avoiding certain words?
Those things can be part of it, but I think it goes even deeper.
Okay.
It's about aligning our actions with our words. Striving to live a life that reflects God's presence in the world.
So if we're saying, hallowed be thy name,
Yeah.
are we also saying, help me to live in a way that honors your name?
I think that's a beautiful way to put it.
Yeah.
It's about recognizing that God's name isn't just a word, but a representation of his character, his values, his love.
Okay.
And when we hallow his name, we're committing to embodying those qualities in our own lives.
It makes me think about how we treat something precious, a family heirloom or a gift from someone we love.
Right.
We handle it with care. We display it with pride.
Yeah.
Maybe it's about treating God's name with that same level of reverence.
Yes.
Not just in our words, but in our actions.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
And it brings us to the next code.
Okay.
Which is, thy kingdom come.
Right.
Now, here's where Oliveira introduces a paradox.
A paradox.
That I find particularly intriguing.
Okay. I'm all ears.
Jesus says the kingdom of God is already here.
Okay.
But we're also told to strive to enter it.
Okay.
And to complicate things further, he says we can only see it with childlike faith.
Wait, so it's both here and not here. How does that even work?
It's a tension. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And it's something we all grapple with. This balance between the already and the not yet, of the kingdom of God.
So how are we supposed to make sense of that in our daily lives?
Right.
Do we just sit around and wait for the kingdom to arrive?
Right.
Or do we try to force it into being?
Oliveira suggests we look to children for guidance. They have this natural trust, this dependence, this way of living in the moment without reservation.
So maybe it's less about achieving something and more about surrendering to something.
You're getting warm.
Okay.
It's about letting go of our need for control and allowing God's reality to permeate every aspect of our lives.
Okay.
When we pray, thy kingdom come, we're inviting God's presence to transform not just our hearts, but our communities, our world.
That's powerful. It's not just about heaven after we die. Wow. It's about bringing heaven down to earth right now.
Beautifully put.
Okay.
And that leads us to the heart of the prayer.
Okay.
Thy will be done.
Oh, boy.
This is a tough one for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Because it involves surrender, which can be a scary word.
Yeah, it's hard to let go of our own desires and plans, even when we know deep down that God's plan is probably better. But honestly, sometimes I wonder if God's will is just a way to avoid responsibility for our own choices. Like, oh, well, it wasn't meant to be. It's all part of God's plan.
That's a fair point.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to distinguish between what we might call God's permissive will versus God's perfect will.
Okay.
Sometimes we make choices that lead us down paths that aren't necessarily ideal.
Right.
But God, in his love, allows us to make those choices and works with us to bring good out of them.
So it's not like God has this predetermined script that we're all forced to follow.
Right.
There's room for free will.
Yeah.
Even if that means we sometimes mess things up.
Exactly. And Oliveira emphasizes that God's will isn't about controlling us, but about guiding us toward our highest good. It's about our transformation, our growth in gratitude, holiness, forgiveness, and our connection with others.
Okay, so it's less about a specific outcome and more about the journey itself.
I think that's a beautiful way to put it.
Yeah.
It's about trusting that God is working in and through us, even when we can't see the big picture.
That's actually quite comforting.
Yeah.
It takes some of the pressure off, you know?
Right.
But still, I struggle with the how of it all.
Okay.
How do we actually discern God's will in our everyday lives?
Yeah.
Is it about waiting for a lightning bolt of inspiration? Or reading tea leaves?
Well, I wouldn't recommend tea leaves.
Okay.
But I think there are a few practical things we can do to try to align ourselves with God's will. One is simply to ask.
You mean actually pray for guidance?
Exactly. It sounds so basic.
Right.
But sometimes we forget the power of simply asking for God's direction.
Okay, so pray for guidance. What else?
Pay attention to your intuition.
Okay.
That inner voice that whispers yes or no when you're faced with a decision.
But what if my intuition is wrong? What if I mistake my own desires for God's voice?
That's a risk we all take, and it's where discernment comes in.
Okay.
And that's another practical step we can take. Seek wise counsel.
Okay.
Talk to trusted friends, mentors, or spiritual advisors who can offer a different perspective.
So it's a combination of prayer, intuition, and wise counsel.
Yeah.
Not exactly a foolproof formula, but maybe that's the point.
Right.
It's about being open to guidance wherever it comes from and trusting that God will meet us in the midst of our seeking.
I think you've summed it up beautifully.
Okay, good.
And that brings us to something a bit more tangible.
Okay.
Give us this day our daily bread.
Ah, yes, the food prayer.
Right.
But I have a feeling Oliveira has something deeper in mind here.
He certainly does.
Okay.
He actually unpacks 3 layers of meaning for daily bread.
Right.
The first is the most obvious physical provision.
Like the Israelites wandering in the desert depending on manna from heaven for sustenance.
Exactly.
Okay.
But he goes beyond the physical, suggesting that daily bread also refers to spiritual communion.
So it's not just about taking, but about giving, too.
Right.
We're called to be broken bread for others.
Yes.
Offering ourselves in service and love.
Precisely.
Okay.
And finally, Oliveira highlights the restorative element of bread. He points to the moment when Jesus shared bread with Peter after his denial.
Oh, wow. It's like God meeting us in our brokenness and offering us a path back to wholeness.
Right.
It's a beautiful image, especially after talking about God's will and trying to figure out this whole messy journey of faith.
And that brings us to the next code.
Okay.
One that's both powerful and incredibly challenging.
Right.
Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us.
Ugh, forgiveness. It's so hard, especially when someone has really hurt us.
Yeah.
Is it even possible to truly forgive someone who has betrayed us, who has caused us deep pain?
Right.
Does forgiveness mean forgetting what happened?
Those are excellent questions.
Yeah.
And while Oliveira is clear that forgiveness is essential for our spiritual growth, he's also realistic about the complexities involved. He doesn't sugarcoat it. He acknowledges that forgiveness is a process.
Yeah.
And a difficult one at that.
So it's not a one-time thing like flipping a switch?
Not at all.
Yeah.
It can take time.
Okay.
And it often involves wrestling with difficult emotions.
Right.
Like anger, resentment, and even a desire for revenge.
But if it's so hard, why even bother?
Yeah.
What's the point of forgiveness if it feels impossible?
That's where Oliveira's insight about forgiveness being a two-way street becomes crucial.
Go.
He reminds us that the way we forgive others is directly linked to how we experience God's forgiveness in our own lives. He uses the analogy of a measuring cup.
Okay.
The amount we pour out to others is the same amount we receive back from God.
So holding on to anger and resentment is actually blocking the flow of God's grace in our lives?
Exactly. It's like building a dam that prevents the river of forgiveness from reaching us.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all fits together.
Yeah.
We move from the personal connection with God as Father to living in a way that honors his name.
Right.
To surrendering to his will.
Yeah.
And then we hit this crucial point of forgiveness, which is both a gift we receive and a gift we give.
Right.
It's like a cycle, right?
Exactly.
The more we receive, the more we're able to give.
And that leads us to the next code.
Okay.
One that's often misinterpreted.
Okay.
Lead us not into temptation.
See, this is where I always get tripped up.
Right.
It sounds like God is actively tempting us. Why would he do that?
That's a common misunderstanding.
Yeah.
What Oliveira highlights
Okay.
is that we're not asking God to prevent us from being tempted altogether.
Okay.
Temptation is a part of life.
Right.
And it's often through those challenges that we grow and learn.
So it's about acknowledging our own weaknesses and leaning on God's strength to overcome them.
Exactly. And Oliveira makes an interesting point about the nature of temptation.
Okay.
He says it's not always these big dramatic events
like
we see in movies.
Yeah.
Often it sneaks in through the small, seemingly insignificant choices we make every day.
Oh, that's so true. Like choosing to gossip instead of speaking kindly, or scrolling through social media for hours instead of spending time with loved ones, or procrastinating on that project I need to finish.
Those are great examples.
Yeah.
It's in those everyday choices that our character is truly tested.
So how do we stay vigilant against these everyday temptations?
Right.
It's easy to get lulled into complacency when the stakes seem small.
Oliveira suggests we cultivate a spirit of mindfulness.
Okay.
Of paying attention to the choices we're making throughout the day. Ask yourself, is this action bringing me closer to God or further away?
It's about being intentional even in the small things, not letting those seemingly harmless choices chip away at our integrity.
Exactly. And it's about having the courage to call on God's help
Okay.
when we feel ourselves being pulled toward those tempting paths.
It's like having a lifeline to pull ourselves back when we're about to fall.
Precisely. And that brings us to the final petition of the Lord's Prayer.
Okay.
Deliver us from evil.
Now, this one seems pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah.
We're asking God to protect us from harm. But I imagine Oliveira has a more nuanced perspective on this as well.
He certainly does.
Okay.
While it's natural to think of evil in terms of physical danger or some kind of demonic force,
right.
Oliveira points out that evil can take many forms.
Okay.
It can manifest as negativity, hatred, greed, and all those forces that seek to destroy goodness and love in the world.
So it's about recognizing that evil isn't always some external force, but something that can reside within us as well.
Exactly. And it's a prayer for both inner and outer protection.
Okay.
We're asking God to help us discern those negative forces within ourselves and to give us the strength to resist them.
This is heavy stuff. I thought I knew the Lord's Prayer.
Right.
But it feels like we've just scratched the surface.
Okay.
It's amazing how these seemingly simple phrases contain so much depth and complexity.
It's a testament to the richness of Scripture and the power of spiritual reflection.
Yeah.
Oliveira has really given us a gift with these 7 codes.
Yeah.
He's provided a new lens through which to view this familiar prayer, one that reveals its transformative potential.
You know, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive.
We have.
Maybe it's a good place to pause and let our listeners digest all this amazing information.
I agree. We've explored the first 4 codes.
Yeah.
The revolutionary shift in prayer.
Uh-huh.
The personal connection with God as Father.
Right.
The challenge of living a life that honors His name.
Yeah.
And the tension of surrendering to His will.
And we've touched on the importance of forgiveness, the subtle nature of temptation,
right,
and the multifaceted nature of evil.
We'll delve deeper into those last 3 codes in our next segment.
Okay.
But for now, I'd encourage our listeners to reflect on what we've discussed so far.
Absolutely. Think about how these first 4 codes resonate with you personally. What challenges do they present? What insights have they sparked?
We'll pick up the conversation in our next episode.
Okay.
But for now, let these ideas simmer and see where they lead you.
Sounds good. Okay, we're back and ready to dive into the second half of these codes from Oliveira's work on the Lord's Prayer. We left off talking about evil,
right,
which is a pretty heavy topic to jump right back into.
Yeah.
Can we maybe ease in with something a little lighter?
Of course. And I think the next code, give us this day our daily bread.
Yeah.
Provides a perfect transition.
Okay.
It's often seen as a simple request for food.
Right.
But Oliveira reveals so much more beneath the surface.
Okay.
Remember those 3 layers of meaning we touched on earlier?
Yeah, the physical, the spiritual, and the, it was restorative, right?
Yes.
I admit when we first talked about those, my mind was still stuck on the whole evil thing.
I understand.
So refresh my memory. What did Oliveira say about the physical aspect of daily bread?
He emphasized that it's not just about having enough to eat.
Okay.
But about recognizing our dependence on God for all our needs.
Right.
He uses the imagery of manna in the desert, highlighting the Israelites' reliance on God for their very survival.
It makes me think about those times when I felt completely lost and alone, like I was wandering in my own personal desert. And then seemingly out of nowhere, something would happen, some small act of kindness or unexpected opportunity that felt like a lifeline. It's like those moments were my own personal manna, reminding me that even when I feel abandoned, I'm not truly alone.
That's a beautiful way to connect it to your own experience.
Yeah.
And it speaks to the power of this prayer to meet us wherever we are in our lives.
Right.
But Oliveira doesn't stop there.
Okay.
He goes on to say that daily bread also refers to spiritual communion.
Right. He used the example of the bread broken at the Last Supper. I have to admit, I'm not Catholic, so sometimes these religious symbols go over my head.
Sure.
Can you unpack that a bit more?
Yeah.
What does that bread represent in this context?
Of course. The bread at the Last Supper symbolizes Christ himself.
Okay.
Offered as nourishment for our souls.
Okay.
It's about receiving God's love and grace into our very being. And it's also about recognizing our connection to one another.
Okay.
As we share in this communal meal, this spiritual sustenance.
So it's not just about individual nourishment, but about being part of something bigger, something that connects us to God and to each other. It's like we're all sharing this loaf of bread, this life-giving force, and in doing so, we're reminded that we're not isolated individuals, but part of a larger community, a spiritual family.
I love that imagery.
Yeah.
And it speaks to that third layer of meaning, the restorative aspect of daily bread.
Right.
Remember the example Oliveira used?
Yeah.
Jesus sharing bread with Peter after his denial.
Yeah, that one really stuck with me, especially after our conversation about forgiveness. It's like God saying, even when you mess up, even when you betray me, I still offer you my love and forgiveness. I still want to share my table with you. It's so powerful because who hasn't felt that sense of brokenness, that need for restoration at some point in their life?
It's a universal human experience.
Yeah.
And that act of sharing bread is a reminder that God's love is always available to us no matter what we've done or how far we've strayed. It's an invitation to come back to the table, to be welcomed back into the fold, and to receive that nourishment that can heal our wounds and restore our souls.
And it makes me think about the flip side of that equation. If we're asking God to give us our daily bread, are we also being asked to be broken bread for others? To offer that same kind of love, compassion, and forgiveness to those who are hurting and in need?
Absolutely. It's not just about receiving, but about giving as well.
Right.
It's about recognizing that we're all part of this interconnected web of life. And we have a responsibility to care for one another, to nourish each other's bodies and souls.
So we've got the physical, the spiritual, and the restorative aspects of daily bread. But this is a prayer, right?
Yeah.
How do we actually put this into practice? Do we just pray for food to magically appear on our tables?
I think it goes beyond that.
Okay.
It's about cultivating an attitude of gratitude for what we have, recognizing that all our blessings ultimately come from God.
Right.
And it's about being mindful of those who are less fortunate.
Yeah.
and finding ways to share our resources and our love.
So it could be as simple as making a donation to a food bank, volunteering at a soup kitchen, or even just sharing a meal with someone who's lonely. Yeah. It's about seeing the daily bread not just as a material thing, but as a manifestation of God's love and care, something we're called to both receive and share.
Exactly. And that brings us to the next code.
Okay.
Which is closely connected to the idea of broken bread and sharing God's love. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us.
Okay, back to forgiveness. We touched on this earlier, but I feel like there's so much more to unpack here. You mentioned that Oliveira acknowledges the difficulty of forgiveness, especially when we've been deeply hurt. So how do we even begin to forgive someone who has caused us pain, who has betrayed our trust? Does forgiveness mean forgetting what happened or pretending it didn't matter?
Those are really important questions.
Yeah.
And I think it's crucial to understand that forgiveness is not about condoning or minimizing the wrong that was done. It's not about forgetting, and it's certainly not about pretending it didn't matter.
Okay.
It's about choosing to release the grip that anger, resentment, and bitterness have on our hearts. It's about recognizing that holding on to those negative emotions is ultimately harming us more than the person who wronged us.
So it's about letting go for our own sake, not necessarily for the sake of the other person?
Exactly. Forgiveness is first and foremost an act of self-care. It's about freeing ourselves from the prison of our own pain and resentment. And it's about opening ourselves up to the healing power of God's grace. Remember that image of the dam blocking the river of forgiveness?
Yeah.
When we choose to forgive, we're essentially dismantling that dam, allowing God's love and mercy to flow freely into our lives.
Okay, that makes sense. But it's still so hard. I mean, it's easy to say forgive and forget, but when you're actually dealing with the raw emotions of betrayal or hurt, it feels almost impossible. Are there any practical tips or techniques that can help us navigate this process?
Absolutely. First, it's important to acknowledge and validate your feelings.
Okay.
Don't try to suppress or deny your anger, hurt, or resentment. Those are natural responses to being wronged.
Yeah.
Allow yourself to feel those emotions, but don't let them control you.
So it's like acknowledging the storm, but not letting it capsize the ship.
Exactly. Once you've acknowledged your feelings, you can begin to explore the reasons why you're holding on to them. What beliefs or assumptions are fueling your anger or resentment? Are you afraid of being hurt again? Are you seeking revenge or retribution?
That's deep. It's like we're doing emotional archaeology, digging down to uncover the root of our pain. But once we've identified those underlying beliefs, what do we do with them?
That's where the real work of forgiveness begins.
Okay.
It's about challenging those beliefs, questioning their validity, and choosing to replace them with more life-giving perspectives.
Okay.
Maybe you need to remind yourself that everyone makes mistakes, even the people who hurt you. Or perhaps you need to recognize that holding on to anger is only poisoning your own spirit.
So it's about shifting our mindset, choosing to see the situation and the person who wronged us in a different light.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that forgiveness is a process, not a destination. It's not something you do once and then you're done.
Yeah.
It's an ongoing practice, a commitment to choosing love over hate, compassion over judgment, and mercy over revenge.
And it's probably messy, right? I mean, there will be days when we feel like we've made progress and then something triggers us and we're right back in the thick of those negative emotions.
That's absolutely normal. Don't beat yourself up when those setbacks happen. Just acknowledge them, learn from them, and keep moving forward on your journey of forgiveness.
It makes me think of that quote, fall 7 times, stand up 8.
Oh, I like that.
It's about resilience, about not giving up on ourselves or on the power of forgiveness to transform our hearts.
Beautifully said. And remember, we don't have to do this alone. We can ask God for help, for the strength and grace to forgive, even when it feels impossible.
Right. And that brings us to the next code that I think ties in perfectly with this idea of asking for help.
Okay.
Lead us not into temptation.
Yes, the temptation clause. This one often gets misinterpreted, as we discussed earlier.
Yeah.
It's not about God tempting us, but about acknowledging our own weaknesses and seeking his guidance to navigate those tempting situations.
Right. We talked about how temptation isn't always some dramatic over-the-top scenario. It's often those small, everyday choices that can lead us astray. But how do we stay vigilant against those subtle temptations, especially when they seem so harmless?
One key is to cultivate self-awareness.
Okay.
Pay attention to your patterns, your triggers, and the situations that make you more susceptible to temptation.
Okay.
What are your weak spots? What are the things that tend to trip you up?
For me, it's definitely procrastination.
Okay.
I can so easily get distracted by social media emails or even just tidying up my desk instead of focusing on the task at hand. It seems harmless, but it can derail my whole day.
That's a great example. And once you've identified your weak spots,
Yeah.
you can start to develop strategies to counter them.
Okay.
Maybe you need to set boundaries around your social media use,
Right.
or create a dedicated workspace that's free from distractions.
It's about setting ourselves up for success rather than setting ourselves up for a fall. And it's about being honest with ourselves about our weaknesses and not being afraid to ask for help.
Exactly. And that's where the prayer comes in. When we say, lead us not into temptation, we're acknowledging that we need God's guidance and strength to resist those tempting paths.
It's like having a spiritual GPS system that can help us navigate those tricky intersections in life.
I love that analogy. And it speaks to the power of this prayer to be a constant companion, a source of support and guidance in our daily lives. But it's not just about avoiding temptation. It's also about seeking what is good, what is life-giving, what aligns with God's will for our lives.
So it's a two-pronged approach, resisting the negative and embracing the positive. But it also requires a certain level of discernment, right?
Yes.
How do we know what's truly good and what's just masquerading as good?
That's where prayer, intuition, and wise counsel come in again. We need to cultivate a spirit of discernment, of being able to distinguish between those things that truly nourish our souls and those that ultimately leave us feeling empty and unfulfilled.
It makes me think of all those times I've indulged in something that seemed pleasurable in the moment, but later left me feeling regretful or even ashamed. Maybe it was overeating or gossiping or spending money I didn't have. It's like I was tempted by the allure of immediate gratification, but in the end, it didn't bring me true happiness or peace.
That's a perfect example of how temptation can disguise itself.
Yeah.
And it highlights the importance of pausing, reflecting, and seeking guidance before making choices that could lead us down those destructive paths.
So it's not about being perfect or never making mistakes, but about having the humility to recognize our own vulnerabilities and to seek help when we need it.
Beautifully said. And that brings us to the final petition of the Lord's Prayer, the one we started with, deliver us from evil.
Okay, back to the heavy stuff. But I feel like we're approaching it from a different perspective now after exploring all these interconnected codes.
Right.
It's not just a plea for protection from some external force, but a recognition that evil can manifest in so many ways, both within ourselves and in the world around us.
Exactly. And it's a reminder that we're not alone in this battle. We have a God who is fighting for us, who wants to see us victorious. But it's not a passive victory where we just sit back and wait for God to do all the work.
Right.
We have a role to play as well.
So it's a call to action, a challenge to stand up against evil in all its forms.
Yeah.
But what does that look like in practice? I mean, I'm not exactly a superhero.
And you don't have to be. Standing up against evil can take many forms.
Okay.
It can be as simple as speaking up against injustice, offering kindness to those who are hurting, or choosing to live a life of integrity and compassion.
Okay.
It's about being a light in the darkness, a beacon of hope in a world that often feels shrouded in despair.
And it starts with that inner work, right? The work of forgiveness, of resisting temptation, of cultivating those qualities that reflect God's love in the world.
Exactly. It's about transforming ourselves so that we can be instruments of transformation in the world around us.
It reminds me of that story about the starfish.
Oh.
A man is walking along a beach after a storm, and he sees thousands of starfish washed ashore. He starts picking them up and throwing them back into the ocean one by one. Another man comes along and says, "What are you doing? You can't possibly make a difference." The first man picks up another starfish, throws it back into the sea, and says, "I made a difference to that one."
That's a beautiful illustration.
Yeah.
It's not about saving the world all at once,
Right.
but about making a difference in the lives of those around us. One act of kindness, one choice for good at a time.
And it's about remembering that we're not alone in this fight. We have God's power working through us, strengthening us, guiding us toward a more just and compassionate world.
Exactly. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the Lord's Prayer. We've explored these 7 codes, uncovering layers of meaning that often go unnoticed in our daily recitations.
It's been an incredible journey, and I feel like I've gained a whole new appreciation for this prayer, not just as a set of words, but as a roadmap for a transformed life.
And I hope our listeners feel the same way. It's been a joy to unpack these insights with you and to witness the connections you've made to your own life experiences.
Me too. And I think the most important takeaway is that this prayer isn't meant to be just recited, but embodied.
Right.
It's a call to action, an invitation to align our lives with God's will, to be agents of love, forgiveness, and hope in a world that desperately needs those qualities.
Beautifully said. So as we conclude this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a challenge.
Okay.
Don't just let these insights fade away. Take them with you into your daily life. Reflect on them, meditate on them, and most importantly, put them into practice.
Yes. Make the Lord's Prayer a living, breathing part of your day, not just a rote recitation, but a guide for how you interact with the world, how you treat others, and how you cultivate the divine within yourself.
And remember, you don't have to do this alone. You have the power of this prayer, the guidance of the Holy Spirit, and the support of a loving community to guide you on your journey.
Thanks for joining us on this incredible exploration. We hope you've been inspired and challenged by these 7 codes, and that you'll continue to delve deeper into the mysteries of faith and life.
Until next time, may the peace of God be with you.
All right, we're back for the final part of our deep dive into the Lord's Prayer. I have to say, going through these 7 codes with you has been like rediscovering a familiar landmark. You know, I've said this prayer countless times, but Oliveira's insights have given it a whole new dimension.
It's amazing how something so familiar can hold such hidden depths.
Right.
We've talked about the personal aspects, the call to forgiveness, even the everyday temptations that sneak up on us.
Right.
But I think it's fitting that we end where we began.
Okay.
With that final petition, deliver us from evil.
You know, when we first started talking about evil, I have to admit my mind went to pretty dramatic places. You know, villains in movies, those big, obvious bad guys. But as we've unpacked these codes, it's become clear that evil is often far more subtle, more insidious.
It's true. Oliveira reminds us that evil isn't always a loud, crashing force. It can be quiet, creeping in through the cracks of our lives, disguising itself as apathy, greed, or even a misplaced sense of righteousness.
It's like that saying, the only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is for good men to do nothing. It's a call to action, to be vigilant, to not turn a blind eye to the darkness that exists both within ourselves and in the world around us.
Exactly. And that's where the power of this final petition comes at. It's not just a passive plea for protection, but a declaration of our intention to resist evil, to stand against those forces that seek to diminish love, hope, and justice.
It's like we're drawing a line in the sand saying this far, no further, but it also feels a bit daunting, you know? Like, how can one person make a difference against such overwhelming forces?
I think it starts with that inner transformation we've been talking about. The work of forgiveness, the commitment to resisting temptation, the cultivation of those qualities that reflect God's love. It's like we're building up our own spiritual immunity, strengthening our defenses against those insidious whispers of negativity, greed, and despair.
So it's about being the change we want to see in the world, starting with ourselves.
Precisely. And as we transform ourselves, we become beacons of light, radiating that love and hope outward, creating ripples of positive change in our communities and beyond.
It reminds me of that story about the starfish.
Oh, yeah.
A man is walking along a beach after a storm, and he sees thousands of starfish washed ashore. He starts picking them up and throwing them back into the ocean one by one. Another man comes along and says, "What are you doing? You can't possibly make a difference." The first man picks up another starfish, throws it back into the sea, and says, "I made a difference to that one."
That's a beautiful illustration. It's not about saving the world all at once, but about making a difference in the lives of those around us. One act of kindness, one choice for good at a time.
And it's about remembering that we're not alone in this fight. We have God's power working through us, strengthening us, guiding us toward a more just and compassionate world.
Exactly. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the Lord's Prayer. We've explored these 7 codes, uncovering layers of meaning that often go unnoticed in our daily recitations.
It's been an incredible journey, and I feel like I've gained a whole new appreciation for this prayer. Not just as a set of words, but as a roadmap for a transformed life.
And I hope our listeners feel the same way. It's been a joy to unpack these insights with you and to witness the connections you've made to your own life experiences.
Me too. And I think the most important takeaway is that this prayer isn't meant to be just recited, but embodied. It's a call to action, an invitation to align our lives with God's will, to be agents of love, forgiveness, and hope in a world that desperately needs those qualities.
Beautifully said. So as we conclude this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a challenge. Don't just let these insights fade away. Take them with you into your daily life. Reflect on them, meditate on them, and most importantly, put them into practice.
Yes. Make the Lord's Prayer a living, breathing part of your day. Not just a rote recitation, but a guide for how you interact with the world, how you treat others, and how you cultivate the divine within yourself.
And remember, you don't have to do this alone. You have the power of this prayer, the guidance of the Holy Spirit, and the support of a loving community to guide you on your journey.
Thanks for joining us on this incredible exploration. We hope you've been inspired and challenged by these 7 codes and that you'll continue to delve deeper into the mysteries of faith and life.
Until next time, may the peace of God be with you.